In the period following the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, the United States Congress enacted a series of laws that gave blacks the rights of citizenship, voting, and equal protection under the law. But when blacks tried to claim those rights, Southern whites tried to deny them. In the late 1860s, white supremacist groups began to organize throughout the South. The largest was the Ku Klux Klan.
The origins of the KKK are a little bit obscure. It seems to have begun in Tennessee. It certainly began among former Confederate soldiers. Initially, it seemed to be given over to pranksterism. But very quickly, the KKK becomes a rubric to describe all sorts of paramilitary and vigilante groups, some small, some large, some politically connected, some relatively ad hoc, that take it as their task to enforce the submission of the now free black population through violent means.
The Klan's presence was especially strong in Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and South Carolina, where blacks equaled or outnumbered the white population. The Klan was made up of former Confederate soldiers, some members of the Democratic Party, and those resistant to Congress's plans to reconstruct the South. They were angry that the Republican Party, who held the majority in Congress and were the ones pushing for civil rights for blacks, were forcing these changes by controlling Southern state governments against the will of white residents there. Klan members terrorized blacks in church, at the polls, and in schools. They intimidated teachers, forcing them to stop teaching black students. They used threats of violence to keep blacks from leaving plantations. And then the threats became real. They beat, tortured, and even murdered blacks to prevent them from voting and from serving as political leaders. Between 1865 and 1877, the Klan and other related white supremacist groups were responsible for more than 4,000 deaths throughout the South.
You might say it's really the first period of homegrown American terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan was the Al-Qaeda of the 19th century.
These acts of terrorism were effective. Many blacks stayed home from the polls out of fear. As blacks overwhelmingly voted for Republicans, Republican-controlled state governments in the South began to weaken.
And this was the beginning of a process that eventually leads to a much more massive white mobilization of vigilante violence, which topple Reconstruction governments through violent means in the middle of the 1870s.
In response to the murders and intimidation, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, a law that directed the federal government to prosecute people who attempted to deny blacks their civil rights. Still, the Klan and other groups continued to grow over the next century.